You found the skeleton. How would you calculate that size? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're taking a look at Kurt Wise, the director of the Creation Research Center at Truett McConnell University in Cleveland, Georgia. He is a paleontology PhD who did his doctoral work at Harvard University. For those of you who don't know, Harvard is considered to be one of the top schools in the United States for basically anything they teach. Truett McConnell is an accredited school, but given that they have a young Earth creation department, I personally think that should probably be revoked, at least for science degrees. Anyway, Dr. Wise is a major contributor to the Is Genesis History group and has continued to produce content on YouTube, and who are working on a new movie as sort of a sequel to Is Genesis History. Today, he's here to tell us about how the nested hierarchy of life breaks down in some cases, which is odd because other YECs tell us that a nested hierarchy is a prediction of creationism, which is also odd because YECs spent decades railing against that and saying it wasn't real until most of them realized that was untenable. Oh well, here's Dr. Wise.
God is a hierarchical God.
It's hierarchical, but okay, I don't really care what claims about God you're going to make if they don't conflict with science, and I don't think this one does per se.
God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. There's a unified hierarchy in the Godhead.
Well, that's close to what most Christians would consider formal heresy, but I'm not here to anathematize people for unusual theology.
We've already examined the organizational hierarchy of life, how that shows a linear hierarchy.
I don't know what that means, or what other media he might be referencing. Maybe if people like this video enough, I'll hunt it down. Tell you what, if this video gets 10,000 likes, I promise to do more Kurt Wise videos. I might do them anyway, but with a number of likes like that, it'll be a promise.
Similar to at least part of the hierarchy of God. What I now want to turn to is another example of hierarchy in organisms, and that is a nested hierarchy of similarity.
So for those of you who don't know, this is the concept that organisms objectively fall into classifications on multiple levels, where each member of a taxon has all the characteristics of that taxon at some point in its life, and that lower taxa exist inside that taxon which themselves have their distinctive characteristics. For example, all vertebrates have a backbone. Within Vertebrata is a group called Mammalia, and all mammals have a dentary-squamosal jaw joint. Within Mammalia is a group called Primates, who have flat nails instead of claws. Within Primates is a group called Hominids, who will have tricuspid molars. So, there are no animals with tricuspid molars who don't also have flat nails, a dentary-squamosal jaw joint, and a backbone. This is in contrast to something like cars. You can put them into a series of classifications, but they don't follow this objective nesting. For example, you could classify them first by manufacturer, then by engine. But the thing is, two manufacturers could use the same engine. Or you could even go with stereo. For instance, Ford could decide to put a stereo receiver made by Pioneer in all of their trucks, and Chevy could decide to use one by Sony. But then they could both use the same engine, and then Ford could use the Sony receiver in their sedans. Humans mix and match parts when designing. This does not occur in living things.
To show this, I need to maybe develop an analogy or something to help here.
I guess you can borrow my automotive analogy.
Let's say I wanted to represent the differences and similarities among a bunch of organisms by putting them on a piece of paper, by putting dots on a piece of paper. Let's say I did have a piece of paper laying out here where a different position on the paper indicates a different shape or form of an organism.
2 isn't nearly enough dimensions for this, but I kinda get it.
Let's say I could represent every organism on the planet on this piece of paper, but when I put one organism, or I identify one organism in one corner and another organism in another corner, what I'm saying is those two organisms are as different from one another as they possibly can be. So if they're located far apart from one another, it means they're very different. In contrast, if I locate 2 points very close to each other on that piece of paper, I'm implying that there is in fact 2 organisms that are very similar to one another. in this fashion, I can theoretically place every single organism on the planet on this piece of paper. And again, when I did that, the organisms that were really close together would be most similar. Organisms that are farther apart would be dissimilar. Now, if we use that way of displaying or understanding organisms, it could be that God could have filled that piece of paper, created organisms in various places on that piece of paper in sort of a random fashion.
Which would be an excellent refutation for evolution. If organisms had more or less randomly determined traits, like having an octopus with a rib cage, an ape with spider fangs, or an eagle with bat wings, that would basically preclude evolution as it's currently understood. Those organisms would not be the result of natural evolutionary process and would have to be designed, since they do what we know designed things do. They mix and match parts.
He could scatter organisms all the way through the piece of paper. If in fact he did that, then there would be organisms displaying the full range of disparity, as different as things could be. He could even put lots of points on there so that you would have both a complete disparity and a high diversity. You could have both high disparity and high diversity, and that would show the multiplicity of the Godhead.
I'm sorry, but more than one organism exists, therefore Trinity? That's a really bad argument. So does Dr. Wise think that Muslims and Jews should expect only one living thing to be in existence? How would that work? What would it eat? Look, I'm not here to argue about the Trinity, but holy cow, is that a horrible argument.
He could have also done it sort of more uniformly. He could have made sure he put the organisms in a very systematic pattern of some. He could fill, again, the whole piece of paper, not in a random sense, but in a very regular sense.
Which again would more or less debunk evolution and confirm that there was some intelligent designer, perhaps even more so than random placement. For example, it could be that all carnivores have the same teeth as a tiger, and all herbivores have the beak and teeth of Triceratops, and all flying animals have pterosaur wings. That would be systematic, and it could be seen as a wise designer knowing what designs are best and implementing them in any organisms that would benefit from those excellent designs. But again, this is not what we see.
That would still have the full disparity, and you could have lots of points, so it could have full diversity. And so again, it could show the multiple nature of God. But he didn't do that either.
Weird how what he did do is exactly what you'd expect from common ancestry, and looks nothing like an intelligent design.
What he actually did looks something like this. This is a little weird. When we start looking at organisms in the planet, this is what we begin to realize is true.
Yep, and we recognize that way back in the day of Carolus Linnaeus.
We've got some species that are really, really close together. We might look at, let's say, one of these would be the horse species. The horses are not really different from not that much different from one another, and the zebras and the donkeys.
See, this is why scientific terminology is important. When he started, I thought he was specifically talking about the species Equus caballus. He said horse species, but now apparently he's just talking about the family Equidae. As a Harvard-trained paleontologist, Dr. Wise should be better at this.
Look at another one. It might be the fruit flies. 5,000 species of fruit flies. They all very similar to one another. They all, for those at least that can recognize fruit flies, it's pretty easy to recognize them as a fruit fly. There's not a lot of difference among them, but there's a lot of species all close together.
Weird, right? It's like maybe they had a common ancestor that itself was a fruit fly.
And then there's often big gaps between these clusters of species.
Those gaps in the hypothetical morphological space, which again is way more than two-dimensional, are themselves a prediction of common descent. As organisms diverge from one another, each new group will follow its own separate line. And so as time goes, they will become more and more morphologically distinct from what was once their near kin. For example, rats, horses, tigers, and humans are all boreoeutherians. The common ancestor of Boreoeutheria probably looked more like a shrew than anything, but as it diverged into various groups, Each went their own way, and now rodents, equids, felines, and apes are quite distinct, and there are large gaps between them, and we do not expect to see a transition between a horse and a human. Instead, we expect to find their ancestors being more and more generalized. And the earliest known ungulate, Protungulatum, looks a whole lot more like an adapid, the earliest primate, than modern primates and ungulates look like each other, because both are far more basal mammals, although you still wouldn't confuse them for each other. Similarly, for all these close clusters that Dr. Wise is mentioning, if we were to fast forward time, they would drift away from each other in this morphological space, while themselves spawning new clusters of species.
There's a lot of difference between the groups, like differences between fruit flies and horses.
Weird choice of comparisons, but yeah, those are very different animals.
This very strange pattern is what we call the nested hierarchy of similarity. Because what happens is when we start looking at these things and identifying them and classifying them, we can first of all group all of these individuals that are within, that are very similar to one another, into species.
I know I'm going to get asked this, so I'll just answer the question preemptively. I have no idea if this is targeted towards adults or children. If it's adults, then that was insulting of the intelligence of his audience. If it's children, I can't imagine a kid sitting through something this boring. That's a problem I find with a lot of creationist output aimed at lay audiences. It's too dumb and goofy for adults and too boring for children.
We can put little circles around them, and everything inside that little circle is a species. And then we can group all of the species together into further groups that we call genera. And then it turns out that there are even clusters of genera that group together. We call those families or taxonomic families. And then it turns out there are groups of taxonomic families that seem to group together separate from others. We call those orders. And it turns out, like over here, we could group these two separately from each other. We could group the families and orders into classes, and we can keep going.
And there are innumerable steps between all of these. Let's just take humans as an example. Their class is Mammalia, and their order is Primate. But between these, we have the clades Boreoeutheria, Euarchontogliers, and Euarchonta. That's 3 steps between class and order. It's at the point that scientists have given up on trying to define what a family is. You just can't compare them across groups. Is Canidae the same level of classification as Varanidae or Opisthotoothidae? No, they're not. The labels we put on some of the longest recognized taxa are just convenient signposts.
We've grouped the classes into phyla, the phyla into kingdoms, the kingdoms into, more recently, domains. Now we call this a nested hierarchy of similarity because similarity is what unites each of the groups, but each of the groupings is nested inside a higher grouping.
That's why it's a good name for it.
So the species groups are nested within the genus groups, which are nested within the family groups, which are nested within the order groups, which are nested within the class groups.
It's like how English is grouped with Frisian in North Sea Germanic, which is grouped with German into the West Germanic languages, which are grouped together with Gaelic, Farsi, Hindi, and Latin as Indo-European languages. And while languages are the result of intelligent agents acting, natural languages are not specifically designed. No one sat down to create English or Hindi grammar. Some people did sit down and describe them, though. No one decided that English should use auxiliary verbs for almost everything, and no one decided that Hindi verbs should all agree with the gender of the subject. Those are both things that just happened. And interestingly, just like with life, in languages we have nested hierarchies. But if you look at design languages like Klingon, Laadan, Esperanto, or Loglan, they do not fall into nested hierarchies unless doing so was a design goal. When humans design things, whether cars, languages, or made-up animals, they do not fall into nested hierarchies unless doing so is a conscious decision to mimic non-designed things. Falling into a nested hierarchy is strong prima facie evidence that the subjects in the hierarchy are not designed.
So we have clusters of similar organisms into successively larger groups, fully nested inside the smaller groups are fully nested inside the larger groups. This is what God actually did when he created organisms. It's an interesting pattern. It's an unusual pattern. It's perhaps a surprising pattern.
Yes, because it's exactly the kind of pattern you would not expect a designer to make unless the designer wanted it to seem like there was no designer. And if God is creating the world to communicate that he is the special creator of living things, and they don't share a common ancestor, it's odd that he designed them exactly the way that he would if his intent was to trick us into accepting evolution. Basically, either common ancestry is true, or the nested hierarchy of life makes God a deliberate liar. Now, I'm not here, as I say, to argue for or against God. But as a pro tip, when your ultimate metaphysical entity deliberately lies about huge swaths of nature, that's going to be a problem for any epistemology you try to construct around it. Basically, your philosophy is going to be incoherent if God is a liar. So, if you believe in a God, you should probably believe he's fundamentally honest.
And when we study these things in organisms, when we begin classifying organisms into these patterns, we realize that that this is actually, we can actually classify most organisms of the planet into this kind of a pattern, into this nested hierarchy of similarity.
There has yet to be a creature found that we can't. There is some confusion at the distal end of the tree since we have some extremely closely related organisms and problems like incomplete lineage sorting. And we know that there was a lot of horizontal gene transfer near the base because, biology is complicated. But still, every extant organism fits our classification system quite nicely. The only area where I'm aware of significant controversy is what to do with the Precambrian rangeomorphs. Because while they're almost certainly animals, their fossils are scant and their anatomy cryptic. So we're not really sure if they're clade or if they're more closely related to some modern animals than others, but still, even to get to Metazoa, the group of all animals, you've already gone through clades such as Eukaryota, Uniconta, Obozoa, Opisthocanta, Holozoa, and Philozoa. So, even though rangeomorphs are perhaps our most confusing group, we can put them well within 6 known clades.
But not all the organisms.
Well, this should be interesting.
We occasionally find some organisms that we find difficult to classify, and we occasionally find some similarities that seem to unite organisms across the whole pattern. So, for example, we might have some species down here on one side of our piece of paper that have a similarity with a number of different organisms on the other side of our sheet of paper.
Hey, like I said, 2 dimensions is not nearly enough.
Now, generally speaking, these 2 organisms don't look alike, but they might contain within them a similarity that unites them in a very odd way. Other characteristics, they don't look at all alike, but they share this really unusual characteristic.
Like echolocating bats and toothed whales who make identical Preston proteins to help with their echolocation. Weird thing is, though, that when you look at the neutral variation in genes for Preston in these groups, they actually do not show any strong similarity. Almost like evolution of an identical protein was driven by selection in 2 relatively unrelated groups, and the similarity is entirely because of selection constraints and not common design, which would predict that the designer would copy-paste the gene.
When that happens, when we've created a classification system for organisms, genera, species within genera, within families, within orders, within classes, and we're happy with it because it's explained 90% of the species, 95% of the species.
Until we get a species where it doesn't belong, I'm going with 100%.
And then we occasionally find these individual similarities that make things that otherwise look very different seem very similar. We call that similarity a homoplasy.
So homoplasy is another word for what I usually call analogous structures. Basically, these are structures or molecules that are similar because they are constrained by function, but they have deep dissimilarities in their structure. A classic example is the difference between bat and bird wings. Both animals fly using their forelimbs as wings, but the structure of the wings are quite different. I'm not sure why homoplasy violates this nested hierarchy. It's a prediction of common ancestry for when relatively unrelated organisms occupy similar niches. It's probably not just a coincidence that ceratopsians and bison have a lot of similarities. They're both large land herbivores living in areas that are not entirely different to each other.
A homoplasy is a similarity that seems to show a type of similarity that belies all the other similarities. All the other similarities seem to create a very nice nested hierarchy, but occasionally you get a similarity that is counter to it.
No, not at all. Remember my example of bat and bird wings? They are similar because both bats and birds fly. But they are different because both organisms evolved flight long after they diverged, and so hit upon different ways to achieve the same method of travel. That's why they are dissimilar under the hood, so to speak. If you found an alleged homoplasy that was actually a copy-paste of a structure from an only distantly connected organism, that'd be a good point. But so far, I'm not aware of that outside of small amounts of horizontal gene transfer. But that gets you at best some extra proteins. No one is going to horizontal gene transfer bird wings onto a monkey or something.
Turns out there's a lot of these all over the among organisms.
Of course there are a lot of homoplasies, because a lot of organisms face similar challenges.
In fact, if you collect, let's say, 20 different species, and you classify them in this sort of fashion, and use, let's say, 24 characters, you're going to find about a fifth of the characters that will be homoplasis, that will actually not be helpful in creating this nice nested hierarchy, but in fact will seem to connect things that are very dissimilar.
I'm not sure how that's some kind of argument, but I would need a citation for those numbers.
That's interesting. Come back to that in a moment. In addition to the homoplasies, we also have organisms, because homoplasies are individual characters of similarity between organisms that are otherwise very dissimilar. We also have organisms that we have trouble classifying into our nested hierarchy.
He hasn't stated it yet, but I'm going with the presumption that these organisms are hard to classify because of a lot of homoplasy. But as we've discussed, homoplasy isn't actually usually a problem for classification, because when you look into the actual characters of the structure in question, you can disambiguate the data. For example, if you just took has wing as a character state, then it lumps birds with bats. But if you instead look at things like digit fusion and number, suddenly bats are nowhere near birds, and they get lumped with other mammals, while birds get lumped in with the other dinosaurs.
Not very many, just a few. Again, 95% maybe of species fit nicely into a nested hierarchy. But then we find those odd organisms that just don't seem to fit.
Okay, so now let's look at how we classify Arctoideans, since that's what we had up on the slide, namely a bear, an ailurid, and a procyonid, all of which are Arctoideans, along with the mustelids and the pinnipeds.
Here's one of the examples. It's one of the most popular examples, and I personally like it because we have these things called lesser pandas in most zoos. They're easy to take care of and they're easy to raise. And so I can take people to zoos and show them the panda and talk about them. The panda is the lesser panda, or also called the red panda, is an interesting little critter. He kind of looks like a raccoon, doesn't he?
He does, because the red panda is the last surviving member of the ailurids, and they are a sister group to Procyonidae, the family that includes the raccoon and the kinkajou.
He's got rings on his tail. He's got it looks like a bandit there on his face. He's got the cute little ears. He actually hangs on a branch in the same sort of way that a panda, that a raccoon does. Raccoon puts two legs on one side of the branch, 2 legs on the other side of the branch. The panda does the same thing, does exactly the same way.
Generally, behavior like this is not considered a good measure of relatedness because of how plastic it is. But yes, red pandas are quite similar to their closest living relatives, to the surprise of no one.
There are a number of features of the panda, the lesser panda or red panda, that make people want to put them in the raccoon family with the raccoons for obvious reasons.
Well, not quite. The kinkajou is the most basally branching member of Procyonidae. Red pandas branch even more basally and get their own family. But then again, since what constitutes a family is arbitrary, there's no reason we couldn't just have simply lumped them in. But when Procyonidae was defined, it didn't include the red panda, and it remains monophyletic without it. So red pandas get their own family name. That's just how taxonomy works.
Yet, there's another character that pandas have, which is called a panda's thumb, that unites the lesser panda with the greater panda. If you count the number of fingers and claws on a panda's hand, he has 5 fingers and 5 claws. But when you watch him eat, he takes his bamboo, he slaps it into his paw, and he peels off the leaves and he eats the leaves. He seems to have a thumb that opposes his fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fingers, and then an additional thumb. That's odd.
It's also a bit of an exaggeration. What the red panda has is a slightly enlarged sesamoid bone, over which a fleshy pad sits for extra grip. It's not really mobile, and it doesn't oppose any digits but the first 1 or 2. It's also largely in line with the other digits. It's not even terribly similar to the greater panda's, quote, thumb, but I'm sure we'll get into that.
Because organisms don't generally have 6 fingers. What's going on here? When you look closely at it, you realize that his thumb is not a thumb.
You also realize that the picture on screen isn't a red panda. It's the hand of a panda bear. Now, Kurt Wise presumably threw this slideshow together, which means he had to find the images. That image is the 25th on a Google image search for panda thumb, and comes from Evidence of a False Thumb in Fossil Carnivore Clarifies the Evolution of Pandas from the 2006 January edition of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, and was written by Manuel J. Salesa, Mauricio Anton, Stephanie Pigne, and Jorge Morales. So either he's not paying attention, which is not great for a Harvard-trained paleontologist PhD, or he just doesn't care and he's willing to lie. I don't know which it is, but neither is great, and the paper supports the convergent evolution of this thumb in Ilurids and in panda bears, with it being first an adaptation to arboreality in Ilurids and to herbivory in bears, which is why in more primitive members of Iluridae, the sesamoid carpal bone in question diverges more. Really what he should have done was have the hand bones of both animals on screen, but then that would ruin the idea that these animals have identical false thumbs, because they don't. Not at all.
As a proper thumb would be one that's actually a finger that's opposing the other fingers. It moves into position opposite the fingers and can be used to clasp and grasp things.
Yeah, like monkeys have. But wait, that means that our almighty designer already had a much better thumb model. Why not just install it on our Chinese friends here? Oh, right, because that would violate the nested hierarchy for real and show his hand. Because for Kurt to be right, God has to be way more serious about divine hiddenness than even most theist philosophers would be okay with. He has to be so serious about it that he's going to lie to us all just to make it seem like he didn't specially design organisms. And here's another thing. The panda bear is a bear. That means that according to basically all creationists, it evolved along with other bears like the short-faced bear, the brown bear, and the sun bear, and the polar bear, from ancestral bears on the ark. Now, no other bears had this false thumb, so either the first bears had a false thumb, and all other bears immediately lost it when getting off the ark, or the pandas had to evolve it. So even according to most creationist models, the panda's thumb is a matter of evolution, not design, at least in bears. So yeah, maybe Dr. Wise shouldn't be using this particular example as a design feature.
His thumb isn't a finger. He's got 5 fingers. All 5 fingers are in the proper position. What he's got is one of the bones on his wrist is a bit longer and produces a stub that functions as his thumb.
Again, kinda. In red pandas, it's more like a grip pad than a thumb, while in giant pandas, it's much more thumb-like.
And he can use that to clean off the leaves of bamboo and eat them. There's only one other organism on the planet that has a panda's thumb, like the lesser panda, and that's the greater panda.
Yeah, that's true, but like it was pointed out in the paper Wise got this picture from, we have fossils of both Ilurids and Ursids in the line of both pandas that show the evolution of the thumb, and in the past, there were far more than 2 species of these types.
The greater panda, though, is a bear. He's united with the bears by a number of characteristics that bears have that the greater panda has. So the question is the lesser panda a raccoon, or is the lesser panda a bear?
Neither. It's an Ilurid, and we have other fossil Ilurids to help trace its ancestry.
Biologists argue about this. They go back and forth. Some put it in the bears, the Procyanid family. Some put it in the... Some put it in the raccoon family, the Procyanid family. Others put it in the bear family, the Ursid family.
Nope. It's an Ilurid, uncontroversially for decades now. An Iluridae is sister to Procyonidae. It's almost like superficial similarities in a sesamoid bone, adapted differently in different lines for different uses that later converge on a similar use, isn't actually all that confusing for scientists, who managed to figure it out just fine.
And others, they aren't willing to commit themselves. They put the lesser panda in its own family.
That's not unwillingness to commit. It's an actual clade with its own diversity in the past. Even Answers in Genesis lists it as its own separate kind, which at least allows you to say that the false thumb could be designed in the red panda, even if it wasn't in the great panda. Also, if we're going with kinds are right about the family level, then an animal which you can't fit into one kind really does seem like an animal going from one kind to another, the kind of thing that creationists say would show evolution. I mean, really, pandas, both red and great, are just a disaster for creationism. But with that, we're going to leave it off for today, and we're going to pick up with the conclusion next time. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please remember to hit like. If you want to support the channel, there are links to do so below. Remember, if you didn't like the video, hit dislike and tell me what you didn't like about it. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe and hit the bell icon and turn on all notifications so you're always notified when I have new content. Anyway, I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. I just want to take a minute to thank my channel members and patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bob Knob, Bent Hovend, Denny5252, Ian Chen, John Ackerman, Chris Love, Landon Noel, Lingwei, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Veed, and Patrick Dennis. The people whose names you see on screen right now are a big part of keeping the lights on here at Casa Dino, and without them, this channel really wouldn't exist in the form that it does now. If you'd like to join this awesome team, there are links down in the description to join the channel or to join my Patreon. It starts at only $1 on Patreon or $1.99 here on YouTube. There's also a convenient join button right below this video if you want to join as a member on YouTube. Joining lets you see most of my videos early, in some cases more than a month early. Also, you can join an exclusive member and patron-only Discord server, which has a pretty direct line to me. And as you go up in tier, you get more and more benefits, including getting your name on this list. If a monthly subscription isn't really for you, but you still like to help out the channel, there's a merch store linked in the description. It has t-shirts, it has baby onesies, it has mugs, it has blankets, anything you want, Dapper Dino branded. And if none of that seems right for you, please just like and share my videos and subscribe to the channel. That helps immensely. Thank you very much.